What is sacred time?
Most traditions attach special meanings to history as a whole, to specific moments in the lifetime of an individual, and to various times in the ordinary cycles of days, months, and years. Ordinary time in human experience is inextricably linked to change, that most troublesome of all realities. Religious traditions offer a partial remedy to the perplexities of change with the notion that reliving or reenacting events of cosmic significance offers a brief respite, an opportunity to stop time or perhaps step out of ordinary time for a moment. From the perspective of a tradition's ritual life, sacred time is the time of ritual encounter with the divine. But in addition, religious believers also seek to hallow decisive life experiences with rites of passage.
Are there any other important Daoist ritual settings apart from public temple and private home?
Perhaps the most common Daoist sacred space is the spectacular, yet temporary structure unobtrusively called an altar, 10. Usually set up in large open fields or vacant lots. Multi-level facades made of bamboo and covered with colorfully decorated paper simulate grand architectural spaces. These altars are the scene of the major festivals, qiao, that extend over several days. They enshrine such popular deities as the Jade Emperor and Zhangdao Ling. Afterwards, the altars are taken down and the decorations burned. Several other ritual venues have been important as well, though not all intended for larger gatherings. Organizations within the various sectarian movements that have come and gone throughout the history of Daoism have typically practiced their own unique and often esoteric rituals, always preceded by elaborate purification. These specialized rituals could take place either in natural settings, such as remote mountain retreats, or in enclosed meditative venues called purity chambers. Their initiates would closet themselves for lengthy periods of disciplined mental focusing.
Is there a central teaching authority for Hindus?
Since Hindu tradition is a complex of many denominations and sub-traditions, there is no central institutional structure that functions as a central teaching authority. Many of the individual denominations and sects maintain systems of checks on the integrity of the tradition in the form of teaching lineages. Instruction has historically been based on oral transmission of the basic sources, along with extensive commentary, both oral and written, on those sources. Perhaps the closest thing to centralized authority is the living master to whom disciples give their uncontested allegiance. That living master embodies both the authority of an unbroken succession of teachers and his or her personal authority as one spiritually connected to the ancient well springs of wisdom. Even the Vedas and the associated primary sacred texts grouped under the heading of Shruti, heard, do not claim the universal adherence of all Hindus.
Who is the Yellow Emperor?
Ancient Chinese lore tells of 5 August emperors whose reigns date back to before 2500 BCE. They are sometimes called culture heroes. In that tradition credits them with providing humankind with a host of skills and essential practical wisdom. As guardians of the 5 sacred mountains, the divine quintet ruled the cardinal directions and the center. Each was associated with a color, green with the east, red with the south, white with the west, black, or dark, with the north, and yellow with the center. By far the most famous and popular of them is Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, giver of such arts as medicine, agriculture, weaving, pottery, silkworm culture, and domestic architecture, to name only a few. Huangdi began his life in legend as a ruler and a shaman, whose magical powers allowed him to confront all manner of evil. Dated either 2697 to 2597 or 2674 to 2575 BCE, he was evidently a patron of the ancient Fangxi, or shamans. But the Yellow Emperor went on to become one of the 2 patrons of an early Daoist school called Huanglao. Perhaps a combination of the first names of Huangdi and Lao Zi. Huanglao Daoism may have begun as a religious movement as early as 3rd century BCE. In any case, though the figure of Lao Zi seems to have upstaged that of Huangdi for some centuries, the Yellow Emperor made a comeback in popularity. In any number of Daoist and popular temples a visitor may encounter a statue of Huangdi prominently displayed, perhaps in his own glass case. Standing erect, the sovereign, of solemn countenance, wears elaborately embroidered robes whose main color is, of course, yellow.
What are trigrams and hexagrams?
Trigrams are sets of 3 vertically stacked horizontal lines made up of every possible combination of broken and solid line. Solid lines stand for the solar male yang, high, bright, active, and dry. Broken lines stand for the earthy and lunar female yin, which is dark, moist, mysterious, and associated with valleys. Combinations of yin and yang in varying proportions give rise to the 8 essential elements in creation. Traditional presentations usually arrange the 8 trigrams as an octagon, at whose center stands the Taiji symbol for perfect yin-yang harmony. Each trigram is arrayed so as to face its opposite in the set. So for example, if you held a compass before you with north pointing up, heaven's 3 solid lines would stand across from Earth's 3 broken lines at what would be north and south. At due east stands water, with a solid line between a pair of broken lines, across from fire, with its broken line sandwiched between solids in the west. At northwest Lakes broken solid, reading from top to bottom, stands across from mountains solid broken. And in the northeast, winds solid broken balances off thunders broken solid. Take the 8 trigrams and arrange them in all possible permutations by stacking one trigram atop another. And you get 64 hexagrams. Pile heaven upon heaven and the result is called the creative principle. Add earth to earth and you get the passive principle. Earth over heaven yields peace, while heaven over earth means stagnation. The single most important source for interpreting these arcane indicators is the I Ching, the classic of change. Tossing and rearranging a set of 50 sticks and then reading them as hexagrams with the help of that text remains a widely popular form of divination.
Do Jewish communities practice excommunication or banishment for religious reasons?
Concern for purity led to the expulsion of lepers, those impure because of contact with the dead, and those suffering from a discharge of bodily fluids. From the camp of the Israelites as described in Book of Numbers 5:1-4. Lepers especially were considered not only unhealthy but ritually and ethically unclean, due to the prevalent belief that such an affliction implied some moral guilt on the part of either the individual or the leper's parents. Elsewhere in the Hebrew scripture we hear of the practice of Hur-em, placing a ban on certain things, such as the spoils of war or the results of ritual sacrifice. In biblical usage, to ban an item was to dedicate it totally to the Lord. Later Jewish tradition used the term Hur-em to apply to a kind of excommunication. When authenticated instances of heretical views came to the attention of rabbinical authorities, they could banish the culprit from the community. The philosopher Baruch Spinoza, 1632-1677, for example, was excommunicated from the Sephardic community for his insistence on the primacy of reason and for views judged to be pantheistic. Earlier a Portuguese Jew named Uriel de Costa, 1585-1640, underwent formal excommunication twice and endured public humiliation for his unacceptable views. Some interpret both Spinoza and de Costa as examples of a clash between Enlightenment views and traditional Jewish beliefs.
What is a sacrament?
Sacrament comes from a Latin root that originally referred to an oath by which soldiers swore their loyalty. Eastern Christians typically call a sacrament a holy mystery. Traditional Christian sources from a variety of churches generally define a sacrament as a visible sign of divine grace bequeathed by Christ himself. Since the Middle Ages, Catholics and Eastern Orthodox Christians have held that there are 7 sacraments of equal spiritual significance: baptism, confirmation, or chrismation, the Eucharist, penance, holy orders, matrimony, and final anointing. Most Protestant communities have accorded a central place to baptism and the Eucharist. Usually called the Lord's Supper, regarding the other five as of lesser importance. But some churches have recently begun to pay greater attention to those five as well. Almost all Christian communities practice baptism frequently, though in very different ways. As for the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper, frequency varies a great deal. Catholic and Orthodox churches, for example, give Holy Communion as part of nearly every liturgical worship service. In most Protestant communities, the Lord's Supper is much more occasional and a ritual set apart from the usual Sunday worship. The Society of Friends, Quakers, and the Salvation Army are the only larger groups that have no sacramental rituals at all.
Are dreams and visions important in Christian spirituality?
Some New Testament accounts describe dreams as a way God communicates warnings or courses of action to the dreamer. An angel tells Joseph to take Mary as his wife and to flee to Egypt, Matthew 1:20, 2:13. A dream warns the Magi not to return to Herod, Matthew 2:12. And as a result of a dream, Pilate's wife counsels her husband to release Jesus, Matthew 27:19. The Acts of the Apostles records a number of instances in which visions supplied needed insights to Peter and Paul, Acts 11:5, 16:19, 18:5, 26:19. Throughout Christian history, individuals have reported special access to divine truth through both dreams and visions. Mystical insight is often described in visionary terms. The claim is not primarily one of optical vision, but of spiritual encounter. More prominent in recent times have been claims concerning apparitions, particularly of the Virgin Mary and Jesus. Individuals who claim to receive special revelations typically communicate the need for peace or repentance and preparation for the coming apocalypse.
What is Chinese imperial tradition, CIT, and when did it begin?
Long before the time of Confucius, a system of beliefs and practices had developed around the role of the emperor in cosmic affairs. The Chinese had come to regard the emperor as the son of heaven. He bore the awesome responsibility of securing the welfare of all his subjects. By discerning and executing faithfully the will, or mandate, of heaven. Though the emperor was called Son of Heaven, he was not considered a deity. He was rather one who had the ultimate sanction for exercising authority on earth. So long as he maintained contact with the heavenly mandate. Whenever a ruler failed to see that his people enjoyed universal justice, the people could justifiably conclude that heaven's mandate had passed to a more worthy leader. Revolution was the solution. Chinese imperial tradition had its pantheon of deities arranged in several hierarchical levels, so that the earthly royal administration appeared to mirror the heavenly. CIT did not revolve around a sacred scripture, nor did it have a separate ecclesiastical structure or ordained priesthood. It did, however, have its own equivalent of religious doctrine. Elaborate rituals comparable in form and content to those of many major religious traditions, and a hierarchical organization complete with ritual specialists. CIT is an integral part of the religious history of China, since it formed the broad backdrop against which nearly the whole of that history has been played out.
What is a dibuk?
Kabbalistic thought included a feature quite foreign to Jewish tradition generally, namely, belief in reincarnation, Gilgal. The idea developed during the Middle Ages as a proof of God's perfect mercy. Even a seriously sinful person who died unrepentant might have another chance to make things right. Since the idea did not fit neatly with the concept of a permanent afterlife of punishment in Gehenna, the Kabbalists gradually modified the idea of transmigration of souls into that of a generalized cosmic flux. Some of the greatest people who died in sin, such as Adam and Eve or Cain and Abel, were said to have returned in a later age. In these cases as David and Bathsheba or Moses and Jethro, with a second chance to make good. Eventually the term dibuk, adhesion, at first a common term for devil, came to refer to the homeless souls of the unforgiven who roamed the cosmos in search of people to possess.
Are there Christian rituals of marriage?
Most Christian communities have developed some form of ritual, however brief or simple, to acknowledge and bless the union of two people in matrimony. Marriage ceremonies can occur in church, in the home, or in some place chosen for its beauty or romantic appeal, such as a garden. By custom, representatives of the church community who preside over the ceremonies typically function as the primary witnesses of the union and sign the marriage license that is then filed as a legal record of the marriage. In that capacity, ministers and priests are acting as representatives of the civil authorities as well. But the ceremony emphasizes the religious context and divine sanction of loving union. Religious weddings often include readings from scripture. Perennial favorites are Genesis 2:18-25 on Adam and Eve, and Paul's splendid description of true love in I Corinthians 13, as well as brief homiletical reflections and exhortation to the new spouses. Catholics, and Eastern churches that call the ceremony the crowning, generally situate weddings in the context of the Eucharistic liturgy. Christians generally believe that the couple themselves effect the marriage and that the officials and assembled community are there to witness and support their union.
Is a reformer anything like a prophet?
Reformers can share important characteristics of prophets, such as their scathing critique of the status quo. But there are also notable differences. First, reformers appear in virtually every tradition whereas prophets do not. Not all traditions teach that their sacred truths are delivered through intermediaries or spokespersons for the divine source. Second, reformers typically do not bring new revelations at all. Nor do they claim an authority that simply abrogates all that has gone before them. Instead, reformers try to awaken in their people an awareness that it is time to change, to renew, to recapture the original spirit that gave birth to the tradition. They do not necessarily advocate jettisoning the tradition's historical heritage to return to the sources, though that can be a feature in some fundamentalist reforms. Some reformers do, however, re-evaluate religious teachings that they believe have become distorted or diluted, and lay the axe to the root of institutions they believe have usurped unwarranted authority. The power of the papacy, for example, was a major target of Christianity's 16th-century reformers. There have been rare instances in which important religious figures functioned as reformers while they lived but were elevated after death to the status of prophets. In those cases it appears that some members of the reformers' tradition chose to break away from the parent tradition so dramatically that they required the added authority of prophethood to legitimize their claim to independence as a new religious entity.
Who are Roman Catholics?
As early as the 4th century, Christendom experienced political and religious tensions between Western, Latin, and Eastern, Greek, styles of theology and governance. These differences were magnified by the East-West division officially declared in 1054, with many Eastern communities, Orthodox or right-believing Christians, proclaiming themselves formally independent of Rome. But the use of the term Roman Catholic came into common use after the 16th century Protestant Reformation. Papal authority, an often contested issue during the previous millennium or longer, again became a critical question. The reformers protested against the Church's rigidly hierarchical structure, officially a kind of oligarchy but often in effect a monarchy in which the Pope enjoyed greater power than the College of Cardinals. The theological counterpart to the hierarchical system of internal governance were distinctively Roman. Teachings on the 7 sacraments and on a vast multi-tiered celestial realm populated by saints and angels. Against these and other symbols of authority and mediated spiritual power, the reformers emphasized the priesthood of the faithful and the unmediated relationship of each believer to God. In response, Roman Catholicism further defined itself through the decrees of the Council of Trent 1545-63, and the Counter-Reformation Spearheaded by the newly founded Society of Jesus or Jesuits, 1540, among other emerging religious orders. Today Roman Catholics constitute about half the number of Christians worldwide.
What place does purification occupy in Shinto ritual?
Few traditions place greater emphasis on the need to purify both participants in ceremonies and the place designated for the rites. Just as the primordial deity, Izanagi, purified himself upon exiting from the underworld, so must all worshippers before engaging in sacred rituals. The contrasting states of pollution or spiritual alienation, kagure, and ritual moral purity, hari, encompass a great deal of what Shinto tradition considers important. Purification with water is a prerequisite to even the simplest acts of worship. As an ordinary part of rituals performed by priests and shrine staff. Purification requires waving a special wand over the individuals or their offerings, and sometimes involves sprinkling salt water or salt. Watch a sumo wrestling match and you will see the behemoth contestants liberally scattering fistfuls of salt across the ring as they enter to confront each other, a clue to the ancient religious associations of the sport. More elaborate purification involves ceremonial bathing to cleanse the individual of pollution and sin. Priests sometimes purify by immersion before major rites. Some adepts seek out sacred mountain waterfalls and stand beneath their frigid cataracts in winter as an especially potent form of purification. Most important is the ceremony called Great Purification, in which priests of the imperial household as well as throughout the country symbolically purify the whole nation, the whole world, according to some interpretations. Reciting special prayers, they mark the middle and end of the year with cleansing. Before a given shrine's major festivals, shrine priests put considerable time and effort into preparing themselves and the site. Officiants enter seclusion the day before the festival, bathe several times, and follow strict rules with respect to clothing, food, and abstinence from sexual activity.
What is meant by the term divination?
Divination comprises a host of specific ritual practices meant to give practitioners a sense of control in the face of life's mystery. It occurs in association with most religious traditions, if only toward the popular fringe. Divination often involves some form of question and answer exchange.
What signs or symbols distinguish Shinto ritual specialists?
Shinto priests wear distinctive garb, called shozaku, modeled on courtly fashions from the Heian period, the days when Japan's capital was in Kyoto. Ritual robes are of several types. They wear a kimono and a kind of very full-cut pants underneath. Outer garments originally indicated courtly rank with various colors: robin's egg blue, red, purple, yellow, and light green, but now a priest's rank is indicated by either the pale blue, black, or red. Outer garments have very wide flowing sleeves and extend down to the feet. For ordinary ceremonies, priests wear a white silk vestment called a karanigo, hunting cloak from medieval times. With the simpler garments for ordinary duties, priests wear a plain roundish hat called eboshi, reserving the taller and more elegant kanmurai for special ceremonies. High-ranking priests wear polished wooden shoes for rituals, and their subordinates wear thong sandals of wood. During all ceremonies, officiants carry a slender, tapered slab of wood called the shaku in the right hand, similar to the one seen in images of Chinese ancestor figures. Since even a layperson sometimes leads rituals and wears these same garments, they do not function like a habit to distinguish priests from laity. When not performing their shrine duties, Shinto priests wear ordinary street clothes. Shrine maidens, Miko, wear a white kimono top and a vermilion or scarlet split skirt. Only when they are performing shrine duties. Musicians, whether priests or not, also wear similar versions of heian court fashion during ceremonies.
What is the Christian feast of Easter about?
Christ chose to suffer death on the cross to save humanity from its sin. And Christ's victory over death fulfilled the promise of redemption. As the name suggests, Easter celebrates the rising of the Son of Life from the dark night of the grave. Christian tradition teaches that when a group of myrrh-bearing women and then the apostles went to the tomb on the third day after the crucifixion, they found the grave empty. Enemies of the early Christians argued that Jesus' followers had taken his body away to give credence to his predictions that he would rise from the dead. New Testament accounts in the Gospels and Acts of the Apostles narrate a number of post-resurrection appearances in which Jesus visited his disciples and spoke with them. The Eastern Christian year is organized entirely around Easter in 3 segments. 10 weeks prior to Easter, 50 days after Easter, and a more generic remainder of the year. Western churches generally accord the Christmas season a liturgical and spiritual importance equal to that of Easter.
Can women exercise religious leadership among Hindus?
Women's roles in Hindu tradition have varied enormously over its long history. During the Vedic period, women apparently participated directly in many major rituals and exercised exclusive leadership in some. As the Brahmanic priesthood rose to prominence, women had fewer opportunities for official leadership. but women have continued to play major roles in many religious rituals outside the Brahmanic system. They often lead women's groups in communal prayer and song in gatherings connected with local observances. Some Brahmin women have functioned as itinerant preachers in rural areas. Others have become specialists, called pundits, in ritual and lore. Perhaps the best known are the women whose role as gurus has attracted seekers and devotees, often from great distances, to take darshan, that is, to be in their presence, and benefit from their counsel.
Are Unitarians Christians? How about Jehovah's Witnesses?
Unitarians, by definition, profess belief in a non-Trinitarian deity, denying the divinity of Jesus. Insistence on the unipersonality of God finds ancient echoes in teachings declared heretical by early church councils. Jesus' role is that of an important prophet, teacher and ethical model, but no more than an especially favored human being. Unitarianism began as an offshoot of radical Reformation groups and in modern times was significantly reinterpreted by American thinkers William Ellery Channing (1780–1842) and transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson (1803–82). Many Unitarians consider themselves part of the larger Christian community, but generally prefer the identity of an open community not defined by assent to a particular body of doctrine. Jehovah's Witnesses was founded in the United States by Charles Taze Russell, 1852–1916. He emphasized messianic expectation based on an Old Testament concept of theocracy. Jehovah's Witnesses publications have generally maintained a consistently critical attitude to mainstream Christian beliefs.
Do Christian communities run private schools for their children?
Private or parochial education continues to be a concern for many Christians. In addition to the thousands of Catholic schools attached to parishes in the United States. For example, other denominations maintain hundreds of schools and Christian academies throughout the country. By far the most numerous are primary schools, but secondary schools and colleges also offer the possibility of more advanced learning in a Christian setting. The majority of non-state institutions of higher education in the United States historically have been founded in connection with religious traditions. For various reasons, including difficulty in securing government funding, large numbers of them no longer retain their original religious affiliation. A notable exception are the clusters of Catholic high schools, colleges, and universities that still identify themselves with that religious sponsorship.
How do Buddhists deal ritually with death and mourning?
Practice varies according to denomination and cultural setting, but there are a number of common elements. These include prayer at the deathbed and preparation of the body, a wake that includes final viewing. Funeral service typically in a mortuary or funeral home, interment. Usually of cremated remains but with full burial in some circumstances, and a series of memorial services at intervals. Beginning immediately after death and then in anniversary years calculated in various different ways. Viewing the body at the wake is a powerful reminder of the universal fact of impermanence. Funeral ceremonies center on recitation or chanting of appropriate sacred texts chosen to help mourners to see the event in the context of the full sweep of human existence. An officiating priest, monk, or minister may offer a eulogy, and participants make offerings of incense. In some places, like Japan, families inter the cremated remains either in a columbarium connected to a temple or in a cemetery on temple grounds. Memorial services are important in virtually all Buddhist denominations, especially when Buddhism interacts with ancient traditions of ancestor veneration. Many Mahayana Buddhists observe memorials 7, 35, 49 and 100 days after death, and after 1, 3, 7, 13, 17, 33, 50 and 100 years. Some consider the 49th day especially important, since at that point the soul ceases its wandering. Theravada practice often includes memorial services 2 days after death at the home, 2 or 3 days after that at the funeral establishment, and again 7 days after interment. The object of the last ceremony is to transfer merit from the living to the dead to ensure a good rebirth. Many Buddhists also offer a meal in the home or elsewhere for mourners after funeral services or interment.
Are there any especially important Shinto holy places?
One of the most striking features of Shinto tradition is the intuition of the world's pervasive sacredness. Wherever the kami are, there is holiness, and that means just about everywhere people are willing to look carefully. Places where the kami dwell are called otabisho, stages on a journey, and are not necessarily identified with shrine buildings. Certain natural settings stand out as particularly potent. Mountains, waterfalls, caves, and trees have attracted Japan's spiritual athletes, ascetics, and pilgrims over the centuries. Mount Fuji remains a revered symbol of natural perfection and beauty, and pilgrims still consider a hike to the volcano's summit spiritually uplifting. On a clear winter's day you can occasionally glimpse Fuji's symmetrical slopes and snowy cap from taller buildings in Tokyo, 60 miles away. And it is easy to see how the mountain has assumed such symbolic importance. In addition to countless holy places left as close to their natural states as possible, sacred architecture marks many others as sacred. Founding stories, Enji, record how Shinto communities have chosen certain sites. These mythic tales tell how, for example, A deity went looking for a suitable dwelling and decided at last on one perfect spot. Amaterasu is said to have revealed in a dream to an imperial princess of old that she wanted her shrine built at Ise. Even into relatively recent times, Shinto tradition has considered such hierophanies sacred manifestations, important explanations as to why certain places are high on the ladder of sanctity and power. But Shinto has not been associated with holy cities as such, as have traditions like Hinduism and Islam, for example. Shinto tradition has not associated the kami so much with urban settings as with pristine nature. Some major shrines, like Kyoto's Heianjang, have arisen conspicuously in the midst of bustling urban areas, showing a surprisingly public face. But most represent the cultivation of holy serenity in an increasingly disquieted world. Major publications list shrines according to their popularity and reputation for spiritual success stories. Rating shrines according to particular categories of greatest interest, such as healing, help on examinations, good starts in new businesses, and fertility.
Do acupuncture and acupressure have any deist connections?
Neither acupuncture nor acupressure is a specifically religious practice. They are associated with healing, but both draw on ancient Chinese principles that have found their way to the center of deist teaching. Illness indicates a lack of qi, the vital force, which courses through the body along an intricate system of meridians. Blockage of vital energy causes an imbalance of yin and yang. Traditional deist-influenced maps of the body associate particular nodes with specific symptoms and internal organs. The whole system is based on a carefully observed network of correspondences. Not only is every part of the human body connected to every other part and to the spirit, but the human microcosm parallels in every detail the macrocosm of the universe. Proper placement of acupuncture needles, or appropriate application of pressure to the malfunctioning energy juncture along any of the meridians seeks to restore the flow and balance, and hence promotes the rise of vital energies that are the essence of health and well-being.
Do Shinto practitioners run private schools for their children?
Private schools equivalent to parochial educational systems in some other traditions have not been institutionally significant in the history of Shinto. Perhaps the closest thing to structured education in Shinto beliefs and values have been occasional government attempts to insert components of Shinto-i.e. traditional or national Japanese ethics into school curricula. In 1937, for example, the Ministry of Education incorporated themes from an 1890 imperial document on education into a new ethics curriculum called Principles of the National Entity, Kokyutai no Hongi. meant to implement the concept of state Shinto. The document emphasizes the historicity of the classic mythical narratives concerning the emperor's divine descent. It praises unquestioning dedication to the corporate good of the Japanese people under the virtuous rule of the emperor. These pre-war governmental actions, however, are entirely different from the grassroots impulses that gave rise to private religious schools in traditions such as Islam and Christianity. There is really no Shinto parallel. In fact, the Meiji and subsequent regimes attempt to teach ethics from on high. So to speak, explicitly forbade religious education on the local or shrine level. Since World War II, however, numerous shrines throughout Japan have developed programs for children and young people, including nursery schools and kindergartens. But these are exclusively social and cultural, rather than religiously educational, developments.
Is there such a thing as Confucian art?
A number of Confucian literati have been credited with some of China's finest landscape paintings. They were particularly attracted to this artistic theme and medium because both were consistent with deep-rooted Confucian values. Images of mystic mountain settings shared scroll space with equally haunting poems that reflected on human life and the grandeur of nature. These visual and literary images were sometimes autobiographical in tone, offering insight into the creator's personal spiritual convictions. Paintings often depicted solitary scholars lost in contemplation of natural beauty, meditating on moonrise or creating calligraphy in a mountain pavilion. Here Confucian tradition crosses paths with classic Daoist views of nature, and with the spontaneous and abstract landscapes painted by Chan Buddhist monks. Painting and poetry became forms of meditation for the literati, expressions of their holistic view of the balance and harmony of nature. Literati painting is a didactic art with ethical impact. For ideally it expresses the feelings of the superior person. Confucian theory accords visual art the ability to communicate ideas too delicate or too forceful for words. The mind of the artist takes precedence over the content of the work. For the ultimate benefit of a great work is that it offers a connection with a person who represents the highest moral values. Great art can arise only out of genuine virtue.
Is there such a thing as a Muslim saint?
In addition to sages and prophets, widespread Muslim tradition holds in high regard other individuals singled out for particularly intimate relationships with God. They are called friends of God, Awliya, pronounced Aliyah, singular Vali, and are generally analogous to what Christians and others mean when they refer to saints. A major difference is that Friends of God are popularly acclaimed as such rather than formally declared by an institutional procedure. Muslims from Muhammad's own generation are among the earliest individuals called Friends of God. Some so designated because of their devotion to the Prophet. Subsequent generations of Muslims have acclaimed Friends of God virtually everywhere right on down to modern times. With the notable exception of Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states. There and in a few other places, modern reformers have sought to purge Islamic practice of devotional customs judged inauthentic expressions of Islam and distortions of core teachings. They have argued that beseeching Friends of God for miracles is simply unnecessary. Since no human being can mediate between the individual believer and his or her God. Virtually everywhere else, from Morocco's marabouts to Indonesia's distinctive Wali Songo, 9 Friends of God. Devotion to holy persons has been an important element in the spiritual life of hundreds of millions.
What is the sign of the cross?
The sign of the cross is a simple and profound prayer. In part it is an action or gesture. A Christian marks himself with the cross to show faith in Christ's saving work. A cross is described on the body by the right hand moving from the forehead to the breast, and then from shoulder to shoulder. In the Eastern Church the cross stroke is made from right to left. In the Western Church from left to right. While tracing the sign of the cross, the Christian says, "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit." This formula, which recalls the words of Christ sending his apostles to teach and baptize, see Matt 28:19, expresses an act of the faith in the Trinity.
Are music and dance important in Buddhist religious ritual?
Formal Buddhist rituals generally do not incorporate music as such. With the exception of more recent denominations that have absorbed practices from Protestant Christianity. Chanting and rhythmic recitation use tones other than those of normal speech but are not usually done to musical accompaniment. Buddhist rituals do, however, make extensive use of a wide variety of sounds and percussive devices. Bells, gongs, drums, hollow blocks, and clappers of many sizes are standard equipment in different areas of temples and monasteries. Large and medium-sized bells signal the beginning of worship services. And Zen masters use smaller bells to signal the end of sessions with individual monks. Large drums announce the time for certain exercises and gatherings. The most common ritual use of sound devices is that of keeping time during recitation and chanting or scriptural texts. Hollow blocks make a hypnotic clop to focus the attention, and heavy bronze bowls emit a rich lingering note that reminds worshippers of the impermanence of all things. The combination of sustained warm bell-like tones punctuated by stark wooden percussion is very effective and surprisingly easy to listen to. Buddhists in various parts of the world sometimes use music and dance paraliturgically, that is, outside of their primary ritual settings. Zen meditative mood, for example, is often associated with the haunting sound of the bamboo flute called the shakuhachi, and Tibetans have traditionally used vigorous dancing in ceremonies such as exorcism and other protective rituals.
What are some of the main varieties of Buddhist religious officials or specialists?
Each of the many distinct denominations and their constituent religious institutions has its characteristic division of labor. One way to keep it all straight is to think in terms of the four functional categories of administration: instruction, pastoral care, and spiritual example. There is naturally some overlapping, but the four categories offer an idea of the kinds of responsibilities and duties Buddhists consider most important. Denominations, monastic institutions, and local temples all have administrative structures and offices. Buddhists use terms roughly equivalent to bishop, abbot, and chief priest or pastor in this regard. Teachers or preceptors are charged with instructing both monastic and lay Buddhists, especially in the meditative disciplines. At the local level, priests and monks who serve the public in monastery, temples and chapels fulfill the pastoral care function, offering such services as counseling and visiting the sick, as well as leadership in worship. A final category that is in many ways distinctively Buddhist, and yet difficult to define, is that of spiritual exemplar. Here are located all the various ranks of revered patriarchs, founders, incarnations of previous holy persons, and individuals celebrated for teaching by example. Tibetan Buddhists, for example, call such people by various titles including Lama, Rinpoche, and Tulku.
How are Jewish religious leaders chosen and given authority?
In biblical times, religious authorities and specialists came largely from hereditary lines within particular tribes that traced their sacred mandates back to the Mosaic revelation at Sinai. Post-biblical developments gradually moved away from hereditary models of religious leadership to a parallel model in which one leader passes on authority to a successor by laying on of hands, called semika in Hebrew. Thus did Moses ordain Joshua and the 70 elders, Numbers 11:16-25, 27:18-23. Members of the Sanhedrin were likewise ordained. But post-biblical communities in the Middle East eventually did away with formal ordination, preferring only to see to it that prospective rabbis were thoroughly versed in Talmudic and legal studies. A number of modern seminaries, or rabbinical colleges as some are called, have broadened their curricula to include non-traditional studies. The better to equip future rabbis to engage more broadly educated congregations. The rich, age-old ritual of Semicha, imposing hands, survives largely in the practice of Orthodox rabbinical academies.
Is the contemporary sect Falun Gong Daoist?
Falun Gong, Dharma will cultivation, also called Falun Dafa, Dharma will of the Buddha way, was founded in 1992 by Li Hongzhi and received official approval by China's Research Society of Qigong Science. Its principal symbol is a circle with a clockwise rotating swastika at its center. Around the central swastika are 4 Taiji symbols. At the cardinal directions, alternating with 4 more swastikas. The swastika is an ancient symbol of apparently South or Central Asian origin that has long been associated with both Hinduism and Buddhism. The iconographic significance of the various rotating symbols is related to the concept of chakras, or energy centers, within the body. Within each person, therefore, resides a miniature of the whole spinning cosmos. This correspondence between the microcosm of the individual and the macrocosm of the universe is an important link to Daoist thought. Falun Gong advertises itself as an alternative to traditional religious traditions such as Daoism and Buddhism, and to practices such as Qigong and Taiji Chuan. Its spiritual leader, Li Hongzhi, says his purpose is to bring ancient wisdom again within reach of ordinary people who find the traditional systems no longer helpful. Drawing on Daoist imagery, Falun Gong's meditative method, combined with ritual movement, aims at helping practitioners to balance, maximize, and release their energies. Chinese authorities almost certainly had complex motives in attempting to suppress the sect in 1999. One concern may be the ancient connection religious Daoism had with messianic and revolutionary movements.
Is there any further symbolism attached to the structure of the calendar?
Each month is divided into 10-day periods, 6 of those in turn considered a special time period, and 6 of those in turn equaling a full year. In addition, each year is divided into 24 climatic periods called breaths or nodes, described by such phrases as full of snow or clear and bright. Every year, month, day, and hour are further identified by a combination of 10 heavenly stems and 12 earthly branches, the monthly or zodiacal symbols. The 10 heavenly stems are associated with colors. 2 stems with each of the 5 symbolic colors, azure, red, yellow, white, black, which are in turn linked to the 4 directions and center as well as to the 5 elements. Branches and stems are both primarily numerical designators, but each also bears important symbolic connotations. if you match one stem with one branch for succeeding years. S1/B1, S2/B2, S1/B11, S2/B12, S3/B1, and so on, you end up back at the beginning after 60 years. In this system, only odd-numbered stems combine with odd-numbered branches. Even-numbered with even-numbered. We are currently in the 60-year cycle that began in 1984. The result of all this calculation is an extremely detailed system of pinpointing special times according to a host of definitive characteristics. Each event occurring on Earth has its heavenly parallel. For every conceivable type of human behavior there is an auspicious moment. The calendar has thus been not merely a way of keeping track of times for religious observances, but a kind of temporal map for negotiating the cosmos as well. Each year, during the 9th lunar month, imperial officials set up the liturgical calendar for the year to come.
Do Hindu communities run private schools for their children?
Among more traditional upper caste Hindus, gurus still provide a special education for boys. But the practice seems to be slowly disappearing. Most active Hindu devotees tend to think of religious education as a matter of family tradition. As a result, apart from the ancient guru affiliation, Hindus generally have not developed school systems analogous to those that some Jews, Christians, and Muslims have established in order to hand on their traditions. Some organizations, such as the Vedanta Society and smaller communities of devotees, offer courses of education generally for older members.
Is salvation an important concept for deists?
Some elements in deist tradition discuss at length the type of salvation from mortality itself. That is quite different from the kind of salvation Muslims and Christians look forward to. Something closer to salvation in spite of mortality. For deists, the most spiritually accomplished individuals are capable of so purifying themselves that they can actually live on eternally in the paradise of immortals. They might appear to die and be buried, but only because they allowed that to happen as a concession to widespread belief and socially acceptable convention. In fact, they are able to substitute something else for their body and to slip away to paradise unnoticed.
Is there a Hindu creed? What are the most basic Hindu beliefs?
Hindu tradition has not historically developed the kinds of creedal formulations so important in some other communities of faith. But a number of important themes run like brightly colored threads through the fabric of the greater Hinduism. Bear in mind that some of the various denominations and Smaller sects interpret these themes in different ways. Material and spiritual existence unfolds in a series of unimaginably long cycles, governed by a cosmic law called Dharma, from a root that means to hold together. That law manifests itself on the level of individual beings as a potentially endless succession or cycle of birth and rebirth. The human predicament consists in getting stuck in that cycle, which is called samsara, cosmic flow, endless wandering. Each being's earthly existence or lifespan comes to an end at death or dissolution. But the state of each one's soul at that moment determines whether that being remains caught in the cycle. All action, karma, has spiritual consequences. To break the cycle, human beings must gradually purify all actions of ego-centeredness, seeking to act only in accord with their personal dharma. According to law of cause and effect, or karma, all deeds done out of inappropriate motivation chain the individual to the will of samsara. Hindu tradition offers various ways of ridding one's actions of all ulterior motive and progressing toward the ultimate goal of liberation, moksha, from the endless cycle of rebirths. Those methods or paths include the classical mode of ritual action, the quest for knowledge and full realization of the ultimate truths of existence, and personal devotion to a manifestation of God. Beginning with the earliest scriptures, the Vedas, and extending through subsequent unfoldings of ever new sources of divine truth as explained by generations of teachers. Hindu tradition offers access to knowledge of God and hence to the hope of salvation.
What other early scriptures are especially important for Shinto practitioners? Is there a Shinto scriptural canon?
Scholars refer to the various sacred texts collectively as Shinton, texts of the deities. But although they generally agree on the importance of a certain set of works, there has never been an official process of canonization by which representatives of the tradition have formally declared certain texts as definitive. Here are the most important of the classical documents. From the early 8th century, the Fudoki, records of wind and earth, provided data about very early religious rituals from major shrines. The early 9th century Kogoshui, 807, or gleaning of ancient words commented on previous documents in an attempt to legitimate the Imbe family against their enemies, the Nakatomi clan. The Manyoshu, collection of countless leaves, anthologizes a large selection of 7th and 8th century Japanese poetry of various genres. Some Shinto scholars have insisted that these poems represent the purest form of Japanese literary expression. First published in 927, the Enji Shiki includes a collection of more than 24 prayer texts. A work called the Kyojiki, also Sendai Kyoji Hangi, or Records of Ancient Happenings, bears the date 620 but was probably contrived as late as the 9th century to compete with the similar sounding Kojiki in antiquity and authority. It amounts to what some traditions might call an apocryphal work, not what it claims to be, but still full of valuable material. Finally, a group of 13th century texts called the Five Shinto Scriptures, Shinto Gobusho, emphasize the antiquity of Japan's Shinto heritage. 17th century scholars who studied these texts as prime examples of Japanese culture and values went on to spearhead the national learning school of thought.
What is the relationship between Daoism and martial arts?
Early each morning, nearly everywhere in China, people gather in public places both large and small to practice a slow graceful routine of physical movements called Tai Chi Chuan. People of all ages can engage in this activity. Though it is not strenuous the way higher speed exercises can be, Tai Chi, also commonly spelled Tai Chi, nevertheless puts noticeable demands on an astonishingly wide range of muscles all over the body. The idea is not simple physical toning, however, even though that is an obvious benefit. Its purpose is to maintain or restore one's overall sense of health and well-being through relaxed concentration. Proper practice relieves blockages of vital energy and returns the whole person to balance and harmony both physically and spiritually. Tai Chi routines and styles are varied, with 3 methods called Chen, Wu, and Yang most common nowadays. Many of the underlying principles in the practice are of Daoist origin and remain a regular part of the regimen in many Daoist monasteries. But it seems more reasonable on the whole to identify Tai Chi as a more generically Chinese phenomenon, since for centuries non-Daoists have made use of it with no apparent direct connection with Daoist beliefs. As for its relationship to actual martial arts, Tai Chi movement is based on the notion that non-aggressiveness, what is called being weak like water, is ultimately more effective than trying to overwhelm one's opponent with brute force. Hence, for example, the Japanese term judo derives from a Chinese term, rodeo, that means the way of yielding.